A nuclear war does not start with an explosion. It starts with a warning system. In some scenarios, the most important decision on Earth has to be made in about 6 minutes. This video breaks down how that system works and what happens once the clock starts.
How many people would a nuclear war between the United States and Russia kill?
5 billion people.
What would happen if the nuclear war started?
For most Americans, nuclear weapons were explained through phrases like deterrence and mutually assured destruction. Inside government, the system was built through real institutions: Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, NORAD in Colorado Springs, and later U.S. Strategic Command at Offutt Air Force Base. From the Manhattan Project forward, the pattern was the same: speed, survivability, and presidential control.
So there's a lot of angles from which I would love to talk to you about this. At first, how would the deaths happen in the short term and the long term?
So, to start off, the reason I wrote the book is so that readers like you could see in appalling detail just how horrific nuclear war would be.
That split between short-term and long-term death has shaped nuclear thinking for decades. Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed blast, burns, and radiation. Later research expanded the picture to fallout, firestorms, damaged harvests, and climate effects far beyond the original targets.
And as you said, second by second, minute by minute. The book covers nuclear launch to nuclear winter. I purposely don't get into the politics that lead up to that or the national security maneuvers or the posturing or any of that. I just want people to know nuclear war is insane. And every source I interviewed for this.
The Pentagon and Stratcom talk about readiness and stability, but figures like Ronald Reagan and Antonio Guterres describe the system in much starker terms. Because once you get close to it, the clinical language breaks down fast.
Book from Secretary of Defense, all retired, nuclear subforce commander, Stratcom commander, FEMA director, etc., on and on and on, nuclear weapons engineers, they all shared with me the common denominator that nuclear war is insane. First millions, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions of people will die in the first 72 minutes of a nuclear war. And then comes nuclear winter, where the billions happen from starvation. And so the shock power of all of this is meant for each and every one of us to say, wait, what? This actually exists behind the veil of national security. And I don't know, most people do not think about nuclear war on a daily basis. And yet hundreds of thousands of people in the nuclear command and control are at the ready in the event it happens.
But it doesn't take too many people to start one.
That is the nuclear age in one contrast: normal life on the surface, permanent readiness underneath. NORAD, the Pentagon, the National Military Command Center, and the submarine force stay active because Cold War planners assumed a slower decision process might be destroyed before it could act.
In the words of Richard Garwin, who was the nuclear weapons engineer who drew the plans for the Ivy Mike thermonuclear bomb, the first thermonuclear bomb ever exploded in 1952. Garwin shared with me his opinion that all it takes is one nihilistic madman with a nuclear arsenal to start a nuclear war. And that's how I begin the scenario.
Ivy Mike, detonated at Inuitak Atoll in 1952, pushed the world into the thermonuclear era. After that, war planning had to account for the destruction of entire cities, hardened bunkers, and a full U.S.-Soviet exchange. Edward Teller and Stanislaw Ulam helped define that new scale.
It means the United States will not wait to absorb a nuclear attack. It will launch nuclear weapons in response before the bomb actually hits.
So the president, as part of the launch on warning policy, has 6 minutes. I guess can't launch for 6 minutes, but at 6-minute mark from that first warning, the president can...
Launch on warning came from the fear that missile silos, bomber bases, and command centers could be destroyed before they could respond. That is why Cheyenne Mountain, NORAD, and the missile fields across Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska became so important.
So, in addition to the launch on warning concept, there's this other insane concept called sole presidential authority. And you might think in a democracy that's impossible, right? You can't just start a war. Well, you can just start a nuclear war if you're the commander in chief, the president of the United States. In fact, you're the only one who can do that.
What she's describing here is the result of decades of Cold War planning. The American nuclear system began with the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. But once the bomb existed, the real question became who controlled it. By 1948, U.S. policy had already centered atomic decision-making in the presidency, and during the Cold War that power only became more concentrated as Washington feared a surprise Soviet strike could wipe out command before a response was sent. That is why institutions like NORAD in Colorado Springs, Cheyenne Mountain, the Pentagon's command system, and later STRATCOM at Offutt Air Force Base became so important. They were built to detect an attack, brief the president, and push out an authenticated launch order in minutes, not hours. So, sole presidential authority is not just a legal quirk. It is the endpoint of a system built for speed, survivability, and retaliation. Even Ronald Reagan, after being read into how short the timeline really was, described that decision window as irrational.
Not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not the U.S. Congress. So built into that is this extraordinary speed. You talk about the 6-minute window. And some people say, oh, that's ridiculous. How do we know that 6-minute window? Well, here's the best sort of, hitting the nail on the head statement I can give you, which is in President Reagan's memoirs.
Reagan matters because even a Cold War hawk came to see the timeline as irrational. Once you explain the 6-minute window from the Oval Office, it becomes personal. One person deciding the fate of Washington, Omaha, Moscow, and far beyond.
He refers to this 6-minute window and he says, he calls it irrational, which it is. He says, how can anyone make a decision to launch nuclear weapons based on a blip on a radar scope? His words, to unleash Armageddon. And yet that is the reality behind nuclear war.
Just imagine sitting there, one person, because the president is a human being.
That reaction is common once officials are fully briefed. The system runs from warning satellites and radars to NORAD, the Pentagon, the president, and then to launch crews and submarines. It was built for speed, not reflection.
Like personally, and knowing that there'll be no more, most likely. And if they somehow survive, they will be suffering and will eventually die. I guess the question that kept coming up is, how do we stop this? Is it inevitable that it's going to be escalated to a full-on nuclear war that destroys everything? And it seems like it will be. It's inevitable. In the position of the president, it's almost inevitable that they have to respond.
I mean, one of the things I found shocking was how little apparently most presidents know about the responsibility that literally lays at their feet, right? So you may think through this 6-minute window. I may think through this 6-minute window.
That gap is built into the presidency. Truman, Kennedy, Reagan, and every later president inherited nuclear authority immediately, but the machinery beneath them stayed largely the same. The office changes fast. The system does not.
But in that process, which is just a couple minutes, everyone is getting ready to notify the president. And one of the first people that gets notified by NORAD or by STRATCOM or by NRO, these different parties that all see the early warning data, one of the first people that's notified is the Secretary of Defense, as well as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because those two together are going to brief the president about, sir, you have 6 minutes to decide. And that's where you realize the immediacy of all of this is so counter to imagining the scenario.
These acronyms are real institutions with distinct jobs. NORAD in Colorado Springs handles warning and attack assessment. The NRO supports key reconnaissance and missile warning capabilities. STRATCOM at Offutt runs strategic deterrence and nuclear operations. And the NMCC in the Pentagon helps transmit the order.
And again, all the presidents come into office, I have learned, understanding the idea of deterrence, this idea that we have these massive arsenals of nuclear weapons pointed at one another, ready to launch, so that we never have nuclear war. But what we're talking about now is what if we did? What if we did? And what you've raised is like this really spooky, eerie subtext of the world right now, because many of the nuclear armed nations are in direct conflict with other nations. And for the first time in decades, nuclear threats are actually coming out of the mouths of leaders.
Deterrence was always a theory about preventing the first shot. After launch, that theory disappears. Then it comes down to what the president, the defense secretary, and the crews in the silos and submarines think is already unfolding.
This is shocking.
So, deterrence, the polite implied assumption is that nobody will launch, and if they did, we would launch back and everybody would be dead. But that assumption falls apart completely. The whole philosophy of it falls apart once the first launch happens.
Absolutely.
Then you have 6 minutes to decide, wait a minute, are we going to hit back and kill everybody on Earth? Or do we turn the other cheek in the most horrific way possible?
No one would launch because it would assure everyone's destruction. Yes, but what if someone did? And in my interviews with scores of top tier national security advisors, people who advise the president, people who are responsible for these decisions if they had to be made, every single one of them said it could happen.
Defense secretaries, national security advisors, commanders, and weapons experts may disagree on policy, but many still reach the same conclusion. Fallible people are running a system built around worst-case assumptions.
They didn't say this would never happen. And so the idea is worth thinking about because I believe that it pulls back the veil on a fundamental security that if someone were to use a tactical nuclear weapon, oh, well, it's just an escalation. It's far more than that.
So, to you, the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, maybe you can draw the line between a tactical and a strategic nuclear weapon. That
Tactical weapons were meant for battlefield use. Strategic weapons were aimed at cities and command systems. But any detonation near Warsaw, Kyiv, or NATO forces could still force Washington and Moscow to guess what happens next.
They cannot be recalled. So that gives you, here's the guy in charge of the arsenal if it has to get let loose, and he doesn't even know that they cannot be recalled. So this is the kind of misinformation and disinformation and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said, when he was talking about the conflicts rising around the world, he said, we are one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear Armageddon.
The danger has never been only deliberate total war. It has also been false warning, technical malfunction, and leaders interpreting fragmentary signals too quickly.
So, just to sort of linger on the previous point of tactical nukes. So, you're describing strategic nukes, land launched, bombers, submarine launched. What are tactical nukes?
So that's the triad, right? And we have the
Right.
triad and Russia has the triad. Tactical nuclear weapons are smaller warheads that were designed to be used in battle.
The triad was the American answer to vulnerability. ICBMs gave speed, bombers gave visibility and partial recallability, and ballistic missile submarines gave survivability. That is why the map matters. Silos in the northern Great Plains, bomber bases like Barksdale and Minot, and submarines hidden in the Atlantic and Pacific.
That is what Russia is sort of threatening to use right now. That is this idea that you would, make a decision on the battlefield in an operational environment to use a tactical nuclear weapon. You're just sort of upping the ante. But the problem is that all treaties are based on this idea of no nuclear use.
That is why the nuclear taboo mattered after 1945. Even as Washington and Moscow expanded their arsenals, both understood that actual first use would break a major political restraint and create a dangerous precedent.
Right? You cannot cross that line. And so what would happen if the line is crossed is so devastating to even consider. I think that the conversation is well worth having among everyone, that is in a power of position. As the UN Secretary General said, this is madness, right? This is madness. The rocket can be tracked. And then imagine learning, wait a minute, after 5 minutes, the rocket can no longer be seen from space. The satellite can only see the hot rocket exhaust. Then the missile enters its mid-course phase, 20 minutes. And that's the ballistic part of it, where it's kind of flying up at between 500 and 700 miles above the Earth.
This is the physics underneath nuclear strategy. A ballistic missile has three main phases: boost, when the engines are burning; mid-course, when the payload coasts through space; and terminal, when the warhead re-enters the atmosphere toward its target. The missile is easiest to detect during boost because the hot exhaust is visible to warning systems. Once that phase ends, the problem becomes much harder, because now officials have to figure out where the weapon is going, how many objects are in flight, and whether this is a limited launch or the start of something much larger. That is why a 30-minute flight does not mean 30 minutes to think. Detection, confirmation, briefing, authentication, and decision-making begin eating up the clock almost immediately. And even that only explains the opening minutes. The longer scientific danger comes after detonation, when fires, soot, and atmospheric cooling can damage agriculture far beyond the countries that were actually hit.
And moving very fast and with the Earth until it gets very close to its target. And the last 100 seconds are terminal phase. It's where the warhead re-enters the atmosphere and detonates. 26 minutes and 40 seconds. Now, in my scenario, I open with North Korea launching a 1 megaton nuclear warhead at Washington, D.C. That's the nihilistic madman maneuver.
Before long-range ballistic missiles, leaders could absorb news slowly. After them, the state had to reorganize around machine speed warning, moving information from space and radar systems to the president before impact.
But hopefully now that allows readers to suddenly see all this as a real, you almost see it as, as poetry, as terrible as that may sound. You can visualize it and suddenly it makes sense. And I think the sense-making part of it is really what I'm after in this book, because I want people to understand. On the one hand, it's incredibly simple. It's just the people that have made it so complicated.
But it's one of those things that can change all of world history in a matter of minutes. We just don't, as a human civilization, have experience with that. But it doesn't mean it'll never happen. It can happen just like that.
I mean, I think what you're after, and I couldn't agree more with, is like, why is this fundamentally annihilating?
Most wars unfold over months or years. Nuclear war compresses decision, destruction, and retaliation into minutes, with populations at risk before most people even know the crisis has begun.
And so on the only bright side of any of this is that, like, the answer lies most definitely in communication.
So there's a million other questions here. I think the details are fascinating and important to understand. So one, you also say nuclear submarines. You mentioned about 30 minutes, 26, 33 minutes. But with nuclear submarines, that number can be much, much lower. So how long does it take for a missile to reach the east coast of the United States from a submarine?
Just when you thought it was really bad,
Yeah.
and then you kind of realize about the submarines. I mean, the submarines are what are called second strike capacity.
Ballistic missile submarines solve the survivability problem. A silo in Wyoming can be targeted, a bomber on a runway can be destroyed. An Ohio-class submarine hidden at sea is much harder to eliminate, which is why submarine forces became central to second strike credibility.
Right? And, it was submarines were described to me this way. They are as dangerous to civilization, and let me say, a nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered submarine is as dangerous to civilization as an asteroid, okay? They are unstoppable. They are unlocatable. The former chief of the nuclear submarine forces, Admiral Michael Connor, told me it's easier to find a grapefruit-sized object in space than a submarine under the sea.
From a military perspective, that survivability is the point. From a human perspective, it means civilization-ending force can remain hidden offshore at all times.
Okay? So these things are like hell machines. And they're moving around throughout the oceans, ours, Russia's, China's, maybe North Korea's, constantly. And we now know they're sneaking up to the east and west coast of the United States within a couple hundred miles. How do we know that? Why do we know that? Yes, they weren't precise on the number, but when you look at
Couple
the map,
hundred.
yep. And that's when you're talking about under 10 minutes from launch to strike.
Undetectable.
And they're undetectable. The map making is done after the fact because of a lot of underwater surveillance systems that we have. But in real time, you cannot find a nuclear submarine.
Under 10 minutes is the number that reveals the whole system. At that point, there is no normal politics left, only warning data, doctrine, a tiny circle of officials, and a command network built to move before the target is hit. And that is the larger takeaway. Nuclear danger does not come only from the size of the weapons. It comes from the fact that the systems around them were built to function under fear, ambiguity, and almost no time at all. What makes this subject so serious is that it is not built on fiction, but on real doctrine, real hardware, and real decision windows measured in minutes. Classified context is about pulling those systems into the open and making them easier to understand. Drop a comment below and consider subscribing for more content.